Today I have with me Johanna J. Brown, also known as Hanna, who has a lifelong passion to help people resolve conflict, clear confusion, and manage change with, in her words, dignity and respect. She is an active consultant for community and court-based mediation, and she regularly provides services for parenting and family disputes. Hanna also serves on mediation rosters for adoption, foster, and kinship. She's trained in elder family mediation to navigate the needs of aging loved ones, and is a certified divorce mediator who provides divorce coaching. Hanna is trained using a multifaceted layering of services in a faith-based process. Her goal is to empower and equip people to live and work in peace. So, as I tell my 10-year-old son, put on your listening ears as we learn from Hanna today how to view and engage with conflict. Welcome to the podcast, Hanna. How are you?
I am well. Thank you so much for having me, Monique. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for being here. I so appreciate you coming on to have this conversation with me. Hanna, I invited you on to have this conversation about conflict resolution and unity because I really believe America has a problem. The problem is we don't know how to respectfully and peacefully disagree. We don't seem to understand the concept of agreeing, to disagree, especially when it comes to politics, party affiliations, mandates like vaccines, and religion. And I don't really know how long we've had the problem, but I can trace it back to when I became keenly aware of it, which was in 2020 when COVID, came on the scene. So I want you today, Hanna, to provide us with some guidance on how to have healthy dialogues around disagreements and conflicts and differences without engaging in blocking people, and without engaging in cancel culture, and without engaging in considering losing relationships, a loss of relationships. And I want you to start us off with a definition of conflict resolution. How do you define it?
Well, thank you so much. As you've said, we see conflict everywhere. We see it at the highest level of our society, with nations being in conflict, with wars and rumors of wars. We see conflict within government. We, see conflict in organizations and schools and churches. It is everywhere. We also see conflict with God. We see that all throughout the biblical narrative. We experience conflict within ourselves. But resolution can really be on a scale. Some resolutions can be in the form of an agreement, an understanding, a plan, a compromise. There can be full reconciliation, partial reconciliation, depending on the situation. And so, in keeping in mind that there's not one way to resolve conflict, there can be endless ways, endless possibilities in how we move forward. It's part of my job to help people explore those possibilities. This is done through exploring, a growth mindset. How can things look differently? How do we widen that lens? So conflict is, there are several different definitions out there. So mine is kind of very broad in that it can be a clash, a difference, an opposing view, opposing force, beliefs, different actions, and also different heart and different motives, different intentions. So it can be very broad in all of those differences when we approach situations without seeing the opportunities that come with it, but only see the obstacles and the challenges and the barriers that come with conflict.
Okay, that's interesting. You use the word clash because it really is a struggle or a battle or a clash, as you said, between, opposing forces. And I was thinking about, as you were talking, how you said you can find so much conflict in the Bible, which is true. Paul in Romans 7:15, in which he said, "For I do not understand my own actions." He's in fact saying, I'm baffled. I'm even bewildered by them because I don't practice what I want to do, but I end up doing the very thing I hate. And I think, Hanna, a lot of people can relate to that, having knowledge of what we should do and that being different from what we actually do sometimes. And it really is a type of inner conflict. And as you said, there's different forms or expressions or types of conflict within ourselves, with God, with others. Everybody in America right now has a front row seat to conflict playing out with others across political, denominational, gender, and social lines. When we talk about interpersonal conflict, I want you to tell us why you think people struggle with resolving interpersonal conflict.
Yeah. So as we've said, there's not a shortage. We spend any time with family or any time in the workplace or in the church, we will see it, we will feel it, we will experience it. Some people more than others. But there are some common themes. I think at the root, one of the themes is that we all struggle with pride. I think that's the basic human condition, right? Of putting our thoughts and beliefs, our needs, wants, desires, choices, all of those things above someone else. We are not usually at the best version of ourselves when people are in conflict or when they're in mediation and they're discussing so many different things. Oftentimes we're not at our best or necessarily considering the other person. And so that is, one area that I see. Another reason is we've already talked about it a little bit. We just kind of get stuck. We don't know how. I think in some ways we've not been taught. How do we resolve conflict? How do we work about it? How do we think about it? How do we respond to it, react? A lot of that is just we really haven't been taught. Another area too is that we oftentimes fail to have accountability in this area. And I see this quite a bit. It's sort of a big one when working with organizations. We think about like an organizational accountability for, say, finances, for example. There's lots of ways to bring financial accountability to an organization or to a church by having outside perspectives, adhering to certain standards of whether or not things are up and all of that. But I think we also lack relational accountability in organizations where there isn't someone that is brought in to have that perspective of how are we managing and stewarding our biggest assets in the people and the relationships. And so failing to have that accountability and submitting to that of how do we really work through this well, without that, we're sort of left to our own devices in a way, and that can certainly produce a lot of fallout.
Okay. What I hear you saying, Hannah, some main factors are pride, getting stuck, and accountability. God really hates pride. It's all over the Bible. Proverbs 16:5, the Lord detests the proud in heart. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And then James 5:16 says, confess your faults to one another. Pray for one another that you'll be healed. That really, from my vantage point, is a biblical form of accountability. And many of us learned in school, Hannah, something called deductive reasoning. It's where you move from one premise or a set of premises to a logical conclusion. And that's so interesting because you mentioned people being an asset, the greatest asset for an organization, in fact. So if we apply deductive reasoning here, just for everybody listening and watching, people are an asset. Assets have value. Therefore, we should value people.
Yes.
Romans 12:10 says, love each other in a way that makes you feel close like brothers and sisters and give each other more honor than you give yourself. So I think one way to approach conflict or differences or disagreements is to understand, as you said, that people have value and should be valued even when we disagree with them or don't like their views or don't like their beliefs, because the fact that God made them is just enough for them to have value. We might not be so hateful or dismissive in how we treat people or respond to the things they say or, even speak to others if we would bear that in mind. Can you tell us, Hannah, what happens when we avoid conflict, when we just don't deal with conflict at all?
Yes, yes. So when I am working with a family or an organization or a church, part of that process is usually sort of to dissect sort of what happened, what brought us to this point, why are we here? And sometimes when things have gone really, really wrong, and it seems more like an autopsy of like what really took place. How did things die? How did this happen? How did this we started on this journey, on this dream, and then somewhere along the way things went sideways. And so one of the biggest factors in sort of doing this for quite some time and exploring some of these real causes, and I think we can see this certainly in our culture, is this element of neglect, really neglecting relationships, neglecting to have the conversations, neglecting the other person's feelings or thoughts or ideas. You start out in a relationship and everything's great, but eventually along the way, if there's the neglect of that, it's sort of, we see this with, a plant. Like if we have plants and we don't water them, we don't nurture them, we don't feed them, we don't give them sunlight, we don't give them room to breathe, eventually they're going to die. And, that's sort of the same thing with relationships. When we neglect to do this well, we neglect to resolve conflict well. I think also too, another area is being conflict avoidant. When we don't resolve conflict, we are change adverse. We become complacent, and that's when a lot of confusion can set in. Think about like avoidance. You think about like the human body. Eventually, when I don't have good health and I have poor choices, that's going to catch up. My health will not increase and improve. It is eventually going to show up elsewhere. When I don't exercise and eat properly, I'm going to feel sluggish and lazy. And so
Yeah.
I think we've become sluggish and lazy in our relationships. And especially when we're talking about the body of Christ, not the human body, but the body of Christ, when we neglect the relationships and to live in community and to fellowship with one another and to really deal with the hard issues, whether it's learning the skills, doing the hard work, the fruit is evident. And, the results is oftentimes the escalation of conflict or the dissolution of a relationship and trust. So you might, an organization or a family or whatever might feel like they sort of dodged a bullet when a situation kind of goes away, but eventually over time that erodes and it breaks down the culture and the opportunity for peacemaking to exist. It will catch up. That's when we see sort of things sort of bleed out, or, we have these breaking points or lines are drawn and people leaving and escaping or resorting to no longer having communication and fellowship with one another. And really, when I trace it back, oftentimes it really does come back to this area of one step at a time neglecting.
That's so interesting. I was thinking of a quote I recently saw as you were talking, and it said that if you don't heal what hurt you, you will bleed
Mhm.
on people who didn't cut you.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned escalated conflict, Hannah, in your line of work. You see that all the time. So give us, those of us who don't see it all the time or aren't as experienced as you, give us 1 to 2 strategies to prevent conflict from escalating.
I typically work in this area, conflict, confusion, and change. I know we've talked quite a bit about conflict, but it's also important to sort of touch on the other two. I think those are really important because not all confusion is conflict. Relational confusion right now is so prominent. And let's just say, for example, a family dispute. Say we're in a family and this dispute has happened, and you nor I caused this dispute to happen. But maybe you sort of understand one person's perspective more than the other. And maybe you sort of side with one person rather than the other. And I do the same. I side with the other. Do you and I actually have a conflict? Potentially not. Potentially we don't have a conflict. Potentially there might be some confusion and me not understanding why you've taken that side or why you've sided with that certain position. And I might be confused about that. And so confusion can certainly escalate to conflict with the absence of not having that conversation and that understanding and that clarity and listening to the other person's heart to alleviate some of that confusion. I think you've touched on a little bit of the polarization that we're seeing politically. And I think that's sort of the same thing applies here in that is that we might have a lot of confusion as to why someone else chose a different political affiliation. And so, do you and I necessarily have an interpersonal conflict? Not necessarily, but we may have confusion about why the other person chose what they did. And without, like I said, having the space and the grace to have the conversation, that can quickly result in assumptions and can certainly quickly result into interpersonal conflict. Another area too is this element of change. So change is just change. It's neither good nor bad, right? It is what it is. And things are constantly changing. So for say example, just to kind of throw a different analogy out there, say that you and I are coworkers and we work in a small department and we have a lot of work to do. And maybe one of our coworkers got a promotion and they're no longer going to be part of the team. And so that's a huge change. That's a big deal for our workflow, for our day. And if we don't manage that change well, and if we don't distribute the work and come up with the plan and figure out how we're going to weather that change, that can escalate and become a conflict, become a big conflict, a big problem. Or maybe because of it, neither of us want to go to work each day. And so that can certainly escalate. So in times of change, it's really important. And I see this also with organizations. Perhaps another scenario is that there's a change in leadership or maybe a pastoral change. And so that change is not managed well, and people are not stewarded or shepherded through that change. It also can quickly escalate to conflict situations. And so, kind of being aware of those two distinctions when they appear and asking, wait, is the origination of this actually a conflict, or is the origination a confusion? And it can certainly provide some steps to take before it escalates.
That's great information. Confusion, can escalate to conflict. How does mediation help resolve conflict once it has escalated? And what are some signs, Hannah, that we might need mediation?
Yeah, so there are lots of tools in the toolbox. Mediation actually falls under a much larger realm of alternative dispute resolution. And so mediation is really one practice within a bigger umbrella. Another practice is peacemaking. There are various styles and practices. The process is relatively the same, but I want to give a little bit of an overview so that your listeners can hear, and if they see this as being helpful in mediation, that potentially it could be the right process. For me, particularly, I tend to have a facilitative narrative approach. And what that means is I'm a facilitator of a process. I get to hear each person's story, understanding what happened. How did we get here? Where did things go wrong? I also get a chance to hear a little bit about what they're hoping for. So it's a process that we do talk a little bit about the past. We talk about the present. What are we doing now? And where are we headed in the future? And I say we because it's working with everyone in the group as they're, exploring solutions. I really give them an opportunity, and this is where the narrative piece comes in, to really sort of turn the page and where they're stuck and hear them out, help them to hear each other out, and begin to work on the various positions to explore mutual interests. So there are some core values and there are some limitations, of course, to the process. And, mediator is a neutral person, neutral or impartial. And I actually prefer to use the word multi-partial. And I know that's a sort of a big word, but essentially it means that I am not an ally to a specific person. I'm an ally to the process, but I am really working with the entire group. And I just desire to see each person succeed in the decisions that they're making, the ability to move forward, but importantly, to see the group, to see the family, to see the organization, to see the church, succeed as a whole. Mediation is also confidential. That is a core value, which means, my notes, myself, I can't be brought in to discuss with other people who weren't there what took place. So it really gives, including, in the legal process, including the judge, it's a really sort of protected, sort of confidential, safe space because oftentimes where people start isn't necessarily where they land. And so talking about those things are all held in confidence. It gives a safe place for people to sort of hash things out without the fear of things being used against them. Of course, there are exceptions and limitations legally to that confidential space, but primarily you really want people to feel safe to contribute, safe to discuss, to feel heard. Mediation is also voluntary, so you can't force anyone to come. Can't force anyone to sit down and have the conversation. At any point, someone can terminate that mediation if they say this is not for them and not choose to participate. So sometimes that's a very good question to ask if someone thinks mediation could be a right process and a right approach, but ultimately, if other people are not willing to participate, there's essentially no way to make that happen. But one thing I do want to note that is, it is proven that decisions and agreements are far more lasting when those decisions and agreements are made from within, from people within who have an opportunity to speak into the process, to be heard, to contribute, to feel valued. And those solutions are often far more lasting. So, for example, it is much better when possible, and it's not always possible, but when possible, for a family to make the decision for the family within the family rather than having a decision, say, by a judge or whatnot, make that decision for the family. So it does create this opportunity for this richness and this robust discussion of how do these decisions that you're trying to be made impact you? How do they impact your family? And so that's a little bit about, just in a nutshell, what mediation can look like.
This concludes my discussion on conflict with Johanna Brown. You don't want to miss part 2, which is coming up next week. Thank you for joining me today on Try Again with Monique. Remember, no matter what you're facing, there's always an opportunity to grow and try again. If this episode inspired you, I encourage you to share it with someone. Subscribe to the podcast and follow along on social media to stay connected. For more episodes and resources, please visit tryagainwithmonique.com. Until next time, stay faithful, stay strong. And remember, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible.